In this lesson we're going to create the shader for our grapes. So let's assign the shader first of all. So I'm going to just select these two grapes. Actually we'll select the separate objects because we don't want to assign it to the stems. And then we'll go to the rendering menu and assign a new material. Shader. And maybe you want to add these to the favorites so it's easier to assign these. So you can right click and say add to favorites. So you've got the AI skin in the favorites and then the AI standard. And maybe just add utility and shadow catcher as well. So now it'll appear here. So you can right click and just choose one of these materials if you want to. So I'll just pick AI skin. And let's rename this to grapes shader. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Open up the render view. And this is going to be a little bit slow to update because it's quite a few objects and they're going to be bouncing light off each other and reflecting and all sorts of things. So I'm going to just make sure that we've got the selection on this region and then just pick a region here. I may make that smaller as we go through because it will be a little bit slower to update. And just in the same, for the same reason, if we go to the render settings, Arnold renderer, just make sure you've reset your camera settings back to 4, maybe even lower. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so there we go. There's our default grapes. Obviously they don't look very good there. So we need to change this. So the thing that we're looking for is a lot of translucency. So we want to see light going straight through. Our light is up here, so we're going straight through and we want to look like it's lighting up this. We also want reflections on this because the grapes are quite reflective, and if they're wet they're going to be fairly reflective, even more reflective. So if they're not wet they're still reflective, they've still got some specular to them. So we're expecting that on the outer layer of the grapes, and then they've got a little bit of translucency on the edges as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and let's just change the radius first of all to adjust the amount of light going through. So we're going to start to make snapshots of these so that we can compare, because it's going to be a lot easier. So let's just, maybe we'll just keep this original one, and then I'm just going to change the colors first of all to something a little bit more interesting. So let's change this color, and I'm going to change it to a kind of green here. So the outer layer, this is going to be the skin, that's going to be the greenest, so I'm just going to make that a little bit darker. And then I'm going to make this mid layer, this is the one which is going to be really poppy, really kind of yellowy green, very bright. So you want to make sure you've got a really bright color, bright green color there. And then this one here is going to be, I'm just going to pick kind of a bright color here. Okay, and then we're going to just turn this weight down overall. I'll just turn this down just so we can see this a bit better. And let's just turn off the specular for now so we can just work on the diffuse for now. Okay, so that's what we're getting. So you can see they look a little bit like olives at the moment because the light isn't passing through as much. So let's keep this image. We're going to just click on this button here. So we keep this image, and then let's go ahead and change the radius. So I'm just going to change it to 5. So it's a good idea to make sure that you've got your AOVs applied here, so specular and SSS. If you haven't already done that from the previous lesson, you can just go to the render settings, AOVs, AI skin, and then just pick them from here and click on this button, and they should be in this section. Okay, this is going to be really useful for us to see what we're getting from each particular shading component. Okay, so you can see that's a lot better. And if I just keep this and compare, you can see how the light is passing through the object and it's kind of lighting up this stuff. So this is really nice. So let's see if we push this even more, what that looks like. So make sure you've pressed this button to keep it, and then I'm going to go and let's just change this to 10. And we've got to turn this off here. Now it's going to update. Okay, so let's compare. Keep this snapshot and look at this. Okay, so you can see it's passing even more light through. So I kind of like this one better, the previous version, because we're getting a little bit of shadow on the edges, which is quite nice in defining the shape of the grapes. And this one, I do like the translucency of this stuff, so maybe something in between would be better. This one, we're losing a little bit of definition. We're going to get some of that back when we apply specular, so this is going to look a lot more rounded when we apply some reflections. I think I might just put that onto 8 and then see what that looks like. So let's just turn this off. Okay, so I think that's a good halfway house between this, and so I think that's probably right. Let me just keep this image just so I can compare nice and easily. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn off the shallow scatter. So if you look here, it looks a little bit too solid, so it still looks like a something like a olive or something like that. So it's a bit too solid on the actual front there. So I'm just going to change the weight here to 0, and then we'll see what that looks like. Okay, so now you can see we're getting a bit of a softer edge on those grapes there, and it's not blowing out as well, it's not getting too bright. So now what we'll do is we'll apply the specular to this. So let's just come down to specular, and I'm going to just put this up to something like 0.6ish, and we'll just see what we're getting. So at the moment we've got a rough specular, so a 0.5, so it's going to be a little bit blurred, and we should see some reflections. So there we go, looking a lot more like grapes now. You can see that the grapes look a lot more rounded. I'm loving what's going on around here. And so let's just keep this. Okay, and so if we compare it between the previous version. Okay, so what we can do now is we can actually vary that specular. So if we were to look, let's just turn this off for a second. If we look at the specular, you can see it's perfectly smooth. So there's no breakup, there's no variation in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to do exactly what we did with this one, is basically we're going to apply a noise map, and we're going to apply this to the roughness. So if we apply this to the roughness, if you think about this number, the whiter this number is, the more blurry the reflection is going to be. And the lower this number is, the darker this number is, the more reflective, the more shiny it's going to be, so less blurred. Okay, so we're going to vary that across the surface so it will look really nice. So what we did in this one was we just turned it up and down, so we just turned the amount of it up and down. But what we're going to do with this one is actually make it a little bit sharper or a little bit more blurry. So let's apply this and see what it looks like. And you can see how useful it is to have that separate to the SSS, because it's really clear to see what's going on. And you can also see that if in the specular, this is not very grainy, but if you look at the SSS, that's where the grain is coming from. Okay, so it's really useful for debugging your shader and seeing what you're getting. So let's go ahead and map this color with a noise again. So we're just going to go to texture, AI noise. I'm going to change the scale of that to 5, just to scale it up a bit. I'm going to select it by clicking this button, and then I'm going to go to shading, isolate selected, and now we can see what we're getting. I'm going to just turn the octaves up a little bit so it's a bit more frequent. Let's try 3, like that. And I'm going to change this lacunarity, and if we turn this up, you can see you get more frequent, kind of more detail within there. So I'm just going to change that up a little bit, just maybe to something like 3.2. And then we're going to do what we did with these cheese cubes, is basically we're going to overblow this. At the moment, let's just see what it looks like at the moment with this applied. So we just go to shading. There shouldn't be much variation because it's all there's not much difference between the white and the black, so you're probably going to see it, but it's not that strong an effect. Okay, so let's have a look. Specular, and you can see that there's some variation, but it's very difficult to tell that something's happening. You can see a little bit there. but it's not much different to the one we had before. So what we need to do is make it a little bit more contrasty. I'll just keep that render by pressing this camera button. And then we'll go ahead and just change this amplitude like we did before to 2. And then we should get a bit more contrast. And the other thing we'll do is we're going to just apply the same texture to the roughness. So at the moment all we're doing is just making it darker and brighter, but we need to apply this to roughness, which is what I was talking about earlier. So this is what it looks like if you apply it to just the specular color. So you can see that it's getting darker and brighter. But let's see what the difference is if we apply this to the roughness as well. Okay, so we're going to apply this to the roughness parameter. So I'm just going to go to the Hypershade, bring this up here, press this button, and then let me just make this bigger. Just go to the grape shader here, and let's just graph this. And we're going to just take this AI noise and middle mouse button that into the specular roughness here. So specular roughness. Middle mouse button drag into there, and you can see that there's a connection there. So let's just move this out of the way. Okay, so you can see the difference there, and we'll just look at the specular here. So there we go. So we can see that some bits are shiny, some bits are like sharp shininess. They've got little points of light here, and some of them have just got broad highlights in certain areas. Okay, so that makes it look much more interesting. So what we can do now is actually have a little bit more specular in terms of, at the moment, the edges are quite bright, but the middles isn't as bright, and that's that IOR function. So we can do with a bit more shininess, with a bit more specular. So I'm just going to turn that up a little bit. So we just select the grape here, go to the grape shader, and then if we turn this up, we should see more specular. You can actually turn this to specular and then watch it as you do this. So let's change this up a bit. So you can see it's getting a lot brighter, and we get some nice highlights in these sections here. It's really nice when it's dark and the only thing you see is subsurface scattering and then some reflection. It looks quite realistic, I think. So you can see this little area here looks like it's wet because it's got a really sharp highlight. Let's have a look. Okay, so this is what we're getting, and you can see it looks really nice and juicy. I think I'm just going to adjust the edges of this a little bit more. So what I mean is that I think it looks a bit too solid. So in terms of this, still looks a little bit like an olive. It's a little bit too solid. So what we can do is just turn this mid scatter down, and so it should make it look a little bit more kind of see-through. So I'm just going to keep this. I think it's just a subtle change, but it's looking pretty good, but I think it's just a subtle change that we need. So I'm just going to change this down to maybe 1.5, and then we'll see what that looks like. These renders are taking quite long now, so I'm pausing it in between just so it's nice and quick for you to see. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and let's keep that as well. So let's see if that made any difference. So this is with the mid scatter on 0.25, so it looks like this, and this is without it. So you can see it just looks a little bit more see-through on the edges here. It's quite subtle, but you can sort of see it. And the good thing to do is basically to look at reference and sort of see what you're trying to get. It's very subtle, the effects that you're trying to sort of achieve, so it's best to look at reference, and that's what I'm doing. I've got a picture to the side, and that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to recreate. If you want to see this with better quality, you can turn up your camera settings here. So in Arnold, just change this up a bit and see what it looks like when it's at the better quality. I'm not going to do that right now. So in this lesson, we set up our grape shader with an AI skin shader, and we adjusted various parameters on here, and we mapped the specular color and the specular roughness with a noise texture to break up the specular. I'm going to make sure you save there.